The house was already wrong long before they ever arrived. Locals used to say it never appeared on maps the same way twice. Some even claimed it shifted slightly every time someone tried to photograph it. No one could agree on when it was truly built or who built it. Records contradicted each other as if history itself refused to remember. The only consistent detail was that people never stayed there long. The couple ignored the rumors when they inherited the property unexpectedly. The letter arrived without a return address or explanation attached. It simply instructed them to claim what was already theirs. They drove into the town under a sky that felt too still and heavy. Even birds seemed to avoid flying over the road leading to the house. The closer they got, the quieter the world became. By the time they saw the house, it already looked slightly different than the photograph. The roofline seemed uneven in places that were previously straight. Still, they convinced themselves it was just fatigue. The first night began with silence so deep it felt unnatural. No wind touched the windows and no animals made any sound. Even their own breathing felt louder than it should have. That silence eventually fractured into faint knocking beneath the floorboards. It started slowly, almost politely, as if testing their awareness. Each knock seemed to wait for a reaction before continuing. They tried to sleep, but the rhythm grew more deliberate and intelligent. It followed their movement across the room exactly. When they froze, it stopped completely for several seconds. The next morning, the house felt unchanged, but somehow less stable. Doors that were closed reopened slightly on their own. Objects were found shifted just a few centimeters out of place. Curiosity slowly replaced fear as they began investigating the structure. The inherited nature of the property made them feel obligated to understand it. That decision would later feel irreversible. A loose floorboard in the living room finally gave way under pressure. It cracked open too cleanly, revealing something far too organized beneath. The break looked intentional rather than accidental. Underneath was another layer of wood that looked significantly older. Its surface was smooth in places that should have decayed long ago. Strange carved markings ran across it in repeating patterns. The symbols felt wrong to look at for too long. Their eyes struggled to hold focus on the shapes properly. It was as if the brain refused to process them completely. They removed more boards, revealing a second constructed surface beneath the first. The realization that there were multiple layers of flooring disturbed them deeply. It suggested intentional concealment rather than renovation. The deeper layer opened into a hollow space that extended beyond expectations. It was not a crawl space, but a full hidden structure. The house above felt suddenly much smaller. Cold air rose from the opening, despite no visible source of ventilation. The temperature difference was immediate and extreme. It felt like standing above an underground breath. They climbed down carefully, guided by shaking flashlight beams. The wood beneath them responded with slow creaking sounds. Each step felt like disturbing something sleeping below. Shadows behaved incorrectly within the hidden space beneath the house. They moved even when nothing physically caused them to shift. Light seemed to bend rather than illuminate properly. At one point, the walls appeared closer than they were moments earlier. The space seemed to compress subtly around them. Distance itself felt unreliable in that environment. Above them, the house groaned as if aware of their descent. The sound was not structural, but almost emotional in tone. It felt like discomfort or resistance. Objects placed on beams below began to shift without contact. Dust patterns changed direction in unnatural ways. Every small change suggested unseen presence nearby. They realized they were being observed without visible observer. The feeling was constant and undeniable throughout the space. Even silence felt intentional and directed. The return path began to feel longer than the descent path. Hallways that were short moments ago stretched unpredictably. The structure refused to behave consistently. A scratching sound moved along the walls surrounding them slowly. It circled their position without revealing origin. The sound seemed curious rather than random. Then everything stopped at once for a brief, unnatural moment. Even dust froze mid-air before settling again. That pause felt deliberate and controlled. When movement resumed, something felt closer than before. The house above no longer felt separate from below. The boundary between layers was weakening. They found old storage records hidden behind a warped panel. The discovery felt too deliberate to be accidental. It was as if the house allowed them to find it. The documents described construction over something already sealed beneath. Multiple builders had worked on hiding rather than building. The purpose was containment rather than habitation. Names of previous occupants ended in unexplained disappearances. No records explained what happened to them afterward. The pattern repeated across decades without deviation. One page described the structure as a containment system. It warned explicitly against disturbing the lower layer. The ink looked newer than surrounding pages. Sketches revealed a second architecture beneath the known foundation. The drawings showed spaces that did not match the visible house. The structure was far larger internally than externally possible. They realized the house was built around something already existing. It was not a home but a covering. Something had been buried alive within architecture itself. The walls reacted more aggressively as understanding increased. Sounds became sharper and more frequent around them. The house seemed aware of their comprehension. Footsteps echoed above, despite no one being present upstairs. The timing matched their own movements below. It felt like imitation rather than coincidence. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Even breathing felt restricted inside the structure. The air itself seemed to resist them. The house began shifting subtly in response to their movement. Rooms no longer aligned perfectly with memory. Navigation became increasingly unreliable. They realized escape routes were no longer consistent or stable. Every attempt to retrace steps led elsewhere. The structure was actively reorganizing itself. Something unseen moved just beyond visual range constantly. It never revealed form but always presence. The awareness of it was unavoidable. Shadows stretched in directions without light sources creating them. The geometry of darkness no longer followed physical rules. Reality felt partially detached. When they turned, the shadows stopped immediately. When they looked away, they resumed movement. It felt like a controlled behavior pattern. The air pressure shifted suddenly around them in waves. Each wave corresponded to unseen movement nearby. The environment was reacting like a living system. A dragging sound began deep within the structure below them. It moved slowly upward through layers. The sound suggested learning movement rather than decay. The entire house groaned, as if adjusting internal position. Wood bent slightly under invisible force. The structure felt increasingly unstable. They attempted to retreat, but pathways no longer matched entry routes. Every direction led to unfamiliar corridors. The house no longer allowed orientation. A violent knocking returned, now surrounding them entirely. It came from every surface simultaneously. There was no single source anymore. The structure beneath them began responding in synchronized rhythm. The pattern matched breathing cycles precisely. It was becoming systemic and unified. They found themselves reading historical accounts hidden within the structure. The documents felt placed rather than lost. The house was guiding discovery. The records confirmed multiple previous occupants vanished without trace. Each disappearance followed attempts to explore below. The warning pattern was unmistakable. One entry described the house as a living containment field. It suggested the structure itself maintained the seal. The house was both prison and guard. The realization changed how they perceived every sound around them. Nothing was random anymore within the structure. Everything was response-driven. The house began reacting more violently to continued investigation. Walls tightened perceptibly in enclosed spaces. Air became harder to draw. Pages of record shifted and rearranged themselves without touch. Information was being actively rewritten or updated. The house was correcting history. A final page warned that disturbance weakens containment integrity. It described consequences of full awakening below. The message ended abruptly mid-sentence. Knocking began from inside the walls themselves at that moment. The sound no longer came from below. It came from everywhere at once. The floor beneath them started behaving like a breathing surface. Wood rose and fell in slow cycles. The entire structure was alive. Dust lifted upward instead of falling naturally. Gravity felt inconsistent in localized areas. Physical laws seemed partially suspended. The rhythm of movement below intensified into clear breathing patterns. It was no longer ambiguous or random. It was deliberate respiration. Symbols beneath the structure began glowing faintly in pulses. Light synchronized with structural movement. Something was fully activating beneath them. Walls emitted continuous low groaning vibrations throughout the space. The house felt like it was preparing to move. Everything was becoming unstable. The exit points disappeared from all visible locations suddenly. Paths that existed earlier were gone entirely. Escape was no longer possible. Sound was absorbed completely by surrounding surfaces instantly. No echo returned from any direction. The house consumed noise entirely. The floor began splitting open in controlled segments slowly. It unfolded rather than breaking. Something beneath was pressing upward deliberately. Eyes briefly appeared within wood grain before vanishing again. They were conscious and responsive for a moment. The structure was watching directly. The air became thick enough to restrict emotional expression physically. Panic felt suppressed internally. Even fear struggled to manifest outwardly. The breathing beneath them accelerated into violent rhythmic surges. The entire house shook in response. Structural coherence was breaking down. Everything paused again in absolute silence for one moment. That silence felt intentional and final. The house was preparing its next action. They realized the entire structure had inhaled completely. Nothing moved anywhere in the building. The pause felt like final judgment. And in that stillness, they understood the house was deciding whether to exhale or not.